2 weeks after my funeral, I watched my brother Mike searching through my jewelry box while my mother sobbed downstairs planning my memorial service. He didn't know I was standing right behind him as he pocketed my grandmother's diamond earrings, the ones Mom had specifically asked him to bring down for the memorial display. But what broke my heart wasn't the theft. It was hearing him whisper to himself, "She won't need these anymore, and Jenny's been wanting nice earrings forever." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name was Jessica Parker, though everyone called me Jess, and I used to think I knew my family pretty well. I was 34 when I died, the oldest of 3 kids, probably the one who'd strayed furthest from our middle-class roots. In suburban Denver, while my siblings Mike and Amy stayed close to home, married young, and started families, I'd thrown myself into building something bigger. My tech company, ConnectEase, had started as a simple idea in my downtown loft, and somehow turned into a multi-million-dollar business that employed over 50 people. I never married, never had kids, but I'd always felt like the family's safety net. When Mike couldn't make his mortgage payment, I'd quietly transfer money to his account. When Amy needed help with her kids' medical bills, I'd pay them directly. To the hospital so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. When Mom's roof needed repairs after that hailstorm last summer, I hired the contractors and told her it was covered by insurance. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was taking care of the people I loved most. Death has a way of stripping away all your illusions about people, especially when those people think you can't see them anymore. The night I died was March 15th, during one of Colorado's surprise late winter snowstorms. I'd been driving back from a business meeting in Colorado Springs. The mountain roads had turned treacherous faster than anyone expected. The last thing I remembered was my car sliding on black ice near the Morrison exit, the guardrail rushing toward me, and then nothing. They told me later that the paramedics worked on me for 20 minutes before giving up, that I'd been unconscious. The whole time that I hadn't suffered, it was supposed to be comforting, I guess. What nobody expected was that I'd wake up floating above my own body in the Denver General Hospital emergency room, watching doctors pull a sheet over my face. At first, I thought it was some kind of nightmare, or maybe a near-death experience that I'd snap out of. But as hours turned into days and days turned into weeks, I slowly accepted the impossible truth. I was dead, but somehow I was still here, still aware, still able to see and hear everything happening around me. The strangest part wasn't being a spirit or a ghost or whatever I was supposed to call myself now. The strangest part was discovering that I couldn't seem to leave. Every time I tried to drift away or find some kind of bright light or peaceful beyond, something pulled me back to my family, to my old life, like invisible threads keeping me tethered to the world I'd left behind. I figured it was probably unfinished business, though I couldn't imagine what that might be. I'd always been organized, always had my affairs in order. My will was updated, my business partnership agreements were clear, and I'd even prepaid my funeral expenses years ago. The funeral itself was beautiful in that heartbreaking way that funerals sometimes are. Mom had chosen my favorite purple dress, the one I'd worn to the company's first major investor meeting. Mike had somehow managed to put together a slideshow, a photo spanning my entire life, from chubby-cheeked toddler to successful businesswoman. Amy had written a eulogy that made everyone cry, talking about how I'd always been the responsible one. It's the one who took care of everyone else. The one who never asked for help, but always gave it freely. Rachel, my business partner and closest friend, spoke about our journey building ConnectEase together. How I'd been the visionary who saw possibilities where others saw problems. She talked about my generosity, my work ethic, and my dream of eventually using our success to help other women start their own businesses. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when she finished. I floated above it all, watching my family grieve. Watching friends and colleagues share memories, watching the life I'd built being celebrated and mourned. It should have been peaceful. It should have given me closure. Instead, I found myself paying attention to the small things, the details that the living never notice when they're consumed by grief. Like how Uncle Bob kept checking his phone during the service, scrolling through what looked like real estate listings, or how my cousin Tyler spent most of the reception asking different family members questions about my business. It's questions that seemed oddly specific for someone who'd never shown any interest in my work while I was alive. or how Aunt Patty kept making comments to my mother about how expensive everything must have been, from the flowers to the reception venue. But it was Mike's behavior that really caught my attention. My brother had always been the charmer of the family, the one with the easy smile and the ability to make anyone feel like his best friend. At the funeral, he'd been the perfect grieving brother, comforting Mom, making sure everyone had food, organizing the practical details that overwhelmed people always need handled. But I noticed how his eyes would linger on my jewelry when he hugged me goodbye at the viewing, how he'd asked Mom very specific questions about my safe deposit box and my home security system. Amy, my younger sister, seemed genuinely devastated by my death. She'd always been the emotional one, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve and cried at insurance commercials. Her grief felt real and raw in a way that comforted me. But even Amy made comments that stuck with me, innocent-sounding observations. About my downtown loft and my mountain cabin in Breckenridge. About how much my car must have cost and whether I'd kept expensive art in my apartment. It wasn't until after the funeral, when everyone had gone home and the flowers had been distributed to nursing homes, that I really understood what I was witnessing. My family wasn't just grieving my death, they were calculating my worth. They were trying to figure out exactly how much money I'd left behind and, more importantly, how much of it they might inherit. The will reading was scheduled for April 1st, 2 weeks after the funeral, which gave everyone plenty of time to work themselves up into a frenzy of expectation and speculation. I spent those 2 weeks following my family members around, listening. 2 conversations I was never supposed to hear. Watching behavior they never would have displayed if they'd known I could see them. Mike's situation was worse than I'd realized. $30,000 in credit card debt I'd known about was actually closer to $50,000. And he was 3 months behind on his mortgage. His wife, Jennifer, a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, had been working double shifts to try to keep them afloat, but it wasn't enough. I watched Mike lie to her about job interviews that didn't exist and loan applications that had already been denied. He'd been telling her that my inheritance would solve all their problems, that his successful sister had probably left him enough to pay off their house and maybe even buy a bigger one. Amy's situation wasn't much better. Her husband, Carlos, worked as a mechanic and brought home decent money. But 3 kids under 10 years old are expensive in ways that people without children can barely comprehend. I watched Amy stay up late at night paying bills, moving money between credit cards, trying to figure out how to afford school clothes and soccer fees and the orthodontist appointments that her oldest daughter desperately needed. She'd been telling Carlos that Aunt Jess had always taken care of the family, that she'd surely left them enough to finally get ahead instead of just getting by. Even Mom, who'd always been the most practical and least materialistic person I knew, had started making plans based on an inheritance she hadn't received yet. She'd called a contractor about finally renovating the kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s. She'd made an appointment to look at new cars, telling the salesman that she'd have the money any day now. She'd even started talking about taking the vacation to Ireland that she and Dad had planned before he died, the trip they'd never been able to afford. Uncle Bob and Aunt Patty were having their own conversations about my estate, and these were the ones that really disturbed me. Bob had always been the family entrepreneur, the one who'd built a small construction business from nothing and took pride in his financial savvy. But I learned that his business was struggling more than anyone knew, that he'd been losing contracts to larger companies and was facing some serious cash flow problems. Patty's real estate career had also hit a rough patch, with the market changing and her traditional approaches not working anymore. I listened to them talking in their kitchen one evening when they thought no one could hear them. Bob was convinced that I'd left him something substantial, maybe even enough to save his business. After all, he reasoned, he'd been like a second father to me after Dad died. He'd taught me about investments and business planning. Surely I'd recognized his influence and rewarded it appropriately. Patty was more focused on my properties. She'd done the research and knew exactly what my downtown loft was worth, exactly what the mountain cabin could sell for in the current market. She'd even started making lists of potential buyers, convinced that I'd left her in charge of selling my real estate with a generous commission built in. Tyler, their 26-year-old son, who'd been living in their basement since graduating college 4 years ago. He had his own theories about my will. He'd convinced himself that I'd left him. My car, a Tesla Model S, that he'd admired every time he'd seen it. He'd also decided that I'd probably set aside money for him to start his own business. Since I'd always encouraged his entrepreneurial ideas even when they were completely impractical. The most heartbreaking conversations to witness were the ones between spouses, the private moments when people revealed their true feelings and deepest fears. Jennifer, Mike's wife, had started looking at bigger houses online, dreaming about finally having enough space for her kids to have their own rooms. She'd been working so hard for so long that the possibility of financial relief had given her hope she hadn't felt in years. Carlos, Amy's husband, had been more skeptical about counting on an inheritance. But even he'd started talking about maybe taking a vacation, maybe fixing up their townhouse, maybe finally feeling like they weren't living paycheck to paycheck. He'd been carrying the financial burden of supporting a family of 5 on a mechanic's salary. And the stress was showing in ways that Amy either couldn't see or chose to ignore. I found myself wanting to comfort them, wanting to tell them that money wasn't everything, that they were all doing better than they realized. But I also found myself feeling angry and disappointed. These people who claimed to love me were spending more time calculating my worth than celebrating my life. They were making plans based on money that might not even exist, at least not in the amounts they expected. The truth was that while I'd been successful, I'd also been generous to a fault during my lifetime. The family safety net I'd provided had cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. The business loans I'd made to Bob that he'd never repaid, the medical bills I'd covered for Amy, the mortgage payments I'd helped Mike with, the gifts and trips and unexpected expenses I'd handled for everyone, I'd given away almost as much as I'd saved, but I'd done it quietly, without keeping track or expecting recognition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As April 1st approached, and the anticipation grew more intense, I found myself dreading the will reading almost as much as my family was anticipating it. David Morrison, the family lawyer who'd handled Dad's estate and helped me set up my business, had been professional but vague when family members called with questions. He'd simply said that all beneficiaries should attend the reading and that everything would be explained then. I knew what was in my will, of course. I'd written it carefully, with David's help, trying to balance my desire to help my family with my deeper conviction that too much money given to easily could actually hurt the people I loved. I'd also wanted to make sure that my real passion, helping other women build businesses like I had, would continue after my death. But watching my family's expectations grow and twist over those 2 weeks, I began to realize that no amount of money would be enough to satisfy what they'd built up in their minds. They weren't just expecting an inheritance anymore. They were expecting a transformation, a complete change in their circumstances that would solve all their problems and fulfill all their dreams. The morning of April 1st dawned gray and drizzly. Typical Colorado spring weather that couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or summer. I followed my family members as they prepared for the will reading, watching each person choose their outfit carefully, as if the right clothes might somehow influence the outcome. Mike wore his best suit and practiced confident expressions in the mirror. Amy chose a black dress that she thought made her look appropriately grieving but also responsible. Mom put on the pearl necklace I'd given her for Christmas, the one she only wore for special occasions. The law office of Morrison & Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a downtown Denver building that had been renovated to maintain its historic character while adding modern amenities. David Morrison himself was a silver-haired man in his 50s who'd known our family for over a decade. He'd helped us navigate Dad's death and had always been patient with Mom's questions about financial planning. As my family gathered in the conference room, I could feel the tension crackling in the air, like electricity before a storm. Everyone was trying to appear solemn and appropriate, but underneath the grief and reverence was an excitement that was impossible to hide completely. They were about to find out how much money I'd left them. Each person had their own private hopes about what that number might be. I floated near the ceiling, looking down at the people I'd loved most in the world. And I realized that this moment was going to change everything between them forever. Money has a way of revealing people's true priorities and hidden resentments. And my family was about to discover things about each other that they'd never suspected. David Morrison cleared his throat and opened the folder containing my will, and I knew that the real story was just beginning. David Morrison adjusted his reading glasses and surveyed the room with the careful expression of someone who'd delivered both wonderful and devastating news many times before. The mahogany conference table reflected the gray April light streaming through the tall windows, and I noticed how each family member had positioned themselves as if they were attending a business meeting rather than mourning a death. Mike sat straight-backed with his hands folded, projecting an image of responsible leadership. Amy clutched a tissue, but kept glancing at the sealed envelope in David's hands. Mom sat quietly in the corner, her pearl necklace catching the light every time she breathed. Uncle Bob had positioned himself directly across from David, as if proximity to the lawyer might somehow influence the outcome in his favor. Aunt Patty sat beside him with a leather portfolio, ready to take notes on whatever real estate assets might need her professional attention. Tyler lounged in his chair with studied casualness, but I could see his knee bouncing under the table with nervous energy. Rachel, my business partner, sat slightly apart from the family group. She'd been crying since she arrived, genuine tears that reminded me why she'd been my closest friend for over a decade. Unlike everyone else in the room, Rachel seemed more concerned with losing me than gaining anything from my death. Her presence felt like a small island of authentic grief in an ocean of barely concealed anticipation. David cleared his throat and began reading in the formal tone that lawyers use to distance themselves from the emotional impact of their words. The opening paragraphs were standard legal language about my sound mind and body, the revocation of previous wills, and the appointment of David himself as executor. I watched my family's faces as they tried to look appropriately solemn, while obviously waiting for him to get to the important parts. The first specific bequest was my downtown loft, and I saw Aunt Patty lean forward with interest. But instead of going to a family member who might need her services to sell it, I'd left the property to the Denver Women's Business Center, with instructions that it be used as office space for female entrepreneurs who couldn't afford downtown rents. The look of disappointment that flashed across Patty's face was so quick that anyone actually grieving might have missed it. Next came my mountain cabin in Breckenridge, which I'd left to a nonprofit organization that provided respite weekends for families dealing with childhood cancer. I'd volunteered with them for years, quietly and without telling my family. And the cabin seemed like a perfect way to continue helping families who needed a peaceful place to heal together. Mike's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as another valuable asset disappeared from the family inheritance pool. David continued reading through a list of specific bequests that clearly weren't what anyone had expected. My car went to Jennifer, Mike's wife, along with a note explaining that I'd noticed how hard she'd been working and how much she deserved reliable transportation. The Tesla wasn't flashy enough to make Tyler visibly upset, but I saw him shift uncomfortably as his anticipated inheritance evaporated. My art collection went to the Denver Art Museum. My jewelry, except for a few specific pieces, went to various charities, and my business equipment was donated to a program that helped women in transitional housing learn job skills. Each bequest was thoughtful and purposeful, but none of them enriched my family in the ways they'd been expecting. The room grew more tense as David moved into the financial portions of the will. Mom was left the house in Lakewood outright, along with $50,000 for maintenance and improvements. It was generous but practical, ensuring she'd never have to worry about housing while not being so much money that it would overwhelm. Her Mike received $25,000 with a specific note that it was intended to help with his children's education expenses, not to pay down personal debt. Amy received $30,000 with instructions that it be used for her family's health and wellness needs, including the orthodontic work her daughter needed and any other medical expenses that arose. It was exactly what she needed, but not nearly what she'd hoped for. I watched her face process the disappointment, trying to look grateful while clearly doing mental calculations about how far $30,000 would actually stretch. Uncle Bob received $15,000 with a note acknowledging his business advice over the years, but specifying that the money was for personal use. It's not business investment. Aunt Patty received $10,000 and a thank you note for always making me feel welcome in their home. Tyler received $5,000 and a message encouraging him to use it for job training or education, rather than starting another business venture. The amounts were reasonable and thoughtful, but they represented a tiny fraction of what my family had been expecting. I could see confusion and disappointment spreading across their faces as David continued reading. Where was the bulk of my estate? Where were the life-changing sums that would solve everyone's financial problems? David paused in his reading and looked around the room with something approaching sympathy. Then he continued with the paragraph that I knew would change everything. The majority of my estate, approximately $3.7 million, was being used to establish the Jessica Parker Foundation for Women's Entrepreneurship. The foundation would provide seed funding, mentorship, and support services for women starting their own businesses, with special emphasis on helping single mothers and women from underrepresented communities. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched my family members process this information, their faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. Mike was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled, but with an edge that I'd never heard before. He asked David if there had been some kind of mistake, if perhaps there was another will, or if I'd made some last-minute changes that hadn't been properly documented. His tone was respectful but insistent, the voice of someone who refused to accept that his financial salvation had just vanished into thin air. David assured him that the will was current and properly executed, that I'd spent considerable time with him over the past year making sure every detail was exactly as I wanted it. He explained that I'd been very specific about my intentions, very clear about wanting to create something that would help other women the way I'd helped my family during my lifetime. Amy spoke up next, her voice shaky with emotion that I couldn't quite identify. She asked about the foundation, whether family members might be able to work for it or benefit from it in some way. The question revealed how quickly her mind had moved from grief to calculation, how she was already trying to figure out an angle that might restore some of her lost expectations. David explained that the foundation would be managed by an independent board of directors, with Rachel serving as the initial chair. Family members could certainly apply for grants like any other applicants, but they wouldn't receive preferential treatment or guaranteed funding. The foundation was designed to be completely separate from family interests. Uncle Bob's reaction was more direct than anyone else's. He pointed out that I'd borrowed money from him years ago for my business, money that had never been formally repaid. Surely that debt should be settled from the estate before any money went to establish foundations for strangers. His construction business was struggling. He needed that money now, and family should come before charity. I remembered those early business loans, the informal agreements we'd made when I was just starting ConnectEase and needed capital to hire my first employees. Bob had helped me when banks wouldn't, and I'd paid him back in full within 2 years, along with generous interest. But I'd done it gradually and quietly, through small business contracts and family gifts that he'd apparently chosen not to remember or acknowledge. David consulted his notes and informed Bob that according to the estate's records, all family loans had been repaid in full, with documentation dating back several years. If Bob believed there were outstanding debts, he was welcome to provide documentation for the estate's review. The lawyer's tone was professional, but carried a subtle suggestion that such claims might not be well received. Aunt Patty tried a different approach, asking about the real estate assets and whether the family had any right to contest the charitable bequests. She pointed out that I'd never shown particular interest in women's business issues while I was alive, that the foundation seemed out of character for someone who'd always put family first. Surely a judge would recognize that my family's needs should take precedence over abstract charitable goals. David's response was measured but firm. He explained that the will had been carefully drafted to withstand any legal challenges, that I'd provided extensive documentation of my charitable interests and philanthropic intentions. Contest proceedings were certainly possible, but would be expensive and unlikely to succeed, and they would delay the distribution of all bequests indefinitely. The family meeting was deteriorating rapidly from a formal legal proceeding into something that felt more like a confrontation. I watched people I'd loved and supported for years reveal sides of themselves that I'd never seen before. The grief that had seemed so genuine at my funeral was being replaced by anger and resentment that felt raw and ugly. Mike's wife, Jennifer, sat quietly through most of the discussion, but I could see her processing the implications. The car I'd left her was generous and practical, but it wouldn't solve their financial crisis. The education money for their children was thoughtful, but wouldn't pay off their house or eliminate their debt. She'd been counting on this inheritance, as much as Mike had, and the disappointment was written clearly across her face. Mom finally spoke up, her voice soft, but carrying a note of confusion that broke my heart. She asked David if I'd left any personal letters or messages for the family, anything that might explain my decisions or provide some insight into my thinking. She seemed genuinely puzzled by my choices, unable to reconcile the generous daughter. She'd known with the person who'd apparently prioritized strangers over family. David reached into his folder and pulled out a sealed envelope with my handwriting on the outside. It was addressed to my family collectively, and he handed it to Mom as the family matriarch. She opened it with trembling fingers and began reading, silently, her expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. The letter was something I'd agonized over for months, trying to find words that would explain my choices without sounding preachy or judgmental. I'd written about my love for each family member, my gratitude for their support throughout my life, my desire to help them in ways that would strengthen rather than weaken their character. I'd explained my belief that too much money given too easily could rob people of their sense of purpose and accomplishment. I'd also written about my philanthropic goals, my dream of helping other women achieve the kind of success that I'd been fortunate enough to experience. I'd described the satisfaction I'd found in mentoring young entrepreneurs, and the joy I'd felt when seeing their businesses flourish. The foundation wasn't a rejection of my family, but an extension of the values they'd taught me about helping others and giving back to the community. Mom finished reading and looked up with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of understanding or acceptance. She asked David if the letter changed anything, if it provided any basis for reconsidering the will's terms. When he explained that it was simply a personal message with no legal significance. She folded it carefully and put it in her purse, without sharing its contents with anyone else. The meeting concluded with David providing contact information for the foundation's initial board members and explaining the timeline for estate distribution. The specific family bequests would be processed within 30 days, but the foundation establishment would take several months to complete. He encouraged everyone to contact him with any questions and reminded them that grief counseling services were available if needed. As my family filed out of the conference room, their body language told a story of disappointment and barely controlled anger. The polite facade they'd maintained during the formal reading was already beginning to crack. Mike walked stiffly beside Jennifer, their whispered conversation clearly heated. Amy clutched Carlos's arm while dabbing at her eyes, though I wasn't sure if the tears were from grief or frustration. Uncle Bob and Aunt Patty left without speaking to anyone else, their faces set in expressions of grim determination that suggested this wasn't over. Tyler followed behind them, his casual demeanor replaced by something that looked almost sullen. Even Mom seemed different as she walked slowly toward the elevator, the letter in her purse apparently weighing heavier than the small amount of hope she'd carried into the meeting. Rachel was the last to leave, stopping to speak briefly with David about foundation logistics. She seemed overwhelmed by the responsibility I'd placed on her shoulders, but determined to honor my vision. As she gathered her papers and prepared to go, she paused at the conference room window and looked out at the Denver skyline where my office building was visible in the distance. I followed my family as they made their way to the parking garage, listening to the conversations that began the moment they thought they were out of David's earshot. The polite grief and solemn respect that had characterized the funeral were nowhere to be found. Instead, I heard anger, resentment, and a growing determination to find some way to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Mike was explaining to Jennifer that there had to be some kind of mistake, that no one in their right mind would give away millions of dollars to strangers while leaving family members struggling. He was already talking about getting a second legal opinion, about investigating whether I'd been unduly influenced by someone or whether the will had been improperly executed. Amy was crying openly now, telling Carlos that she didn't understand how I could have been so selfish, so blind to my own family's needs. The orthodontic work their daughter needed would cost almost as much as Amy's entire inheritance, and there were two other children with their own expensive needs. How was she supposed to explain to them that Aunt Jess had left their college fund to help complete strangers? Uncle Bob and Aunt Patty were having their own intense discussion about legal options and contest procedures. Bob was convinced that the loans he'd made to me years ago had never been properly repaid, despite what David's records showed. Patty was talking about undue influence and questionable mental capacity, suggesting that successful business people didn't normally give away their life's work to charity unless someone had manipulated them. Even Mom, who'd always been the voice of reason and family harmony, seemed shaken by the afternoon's revelations. She was telling her sister on the phone that she didn't recognize the daughter who'd written that will, that the Jessica she'd raised would never have abandoned her family in favor of abstract charitable goals. As I watched my family drive away, in their separate cars, all heading home to continue processing their disappointment and anger, I realized that the will reading had been just the beginning. The money I'd thought would be a simple transfer of wealth was going to become the catalyst for conflicts and resentments that might never heal. My attempt to balance family care with broader philanthropy had pleased no one and satisfied everyone's sense of entitlement. The foundation that was supposed to be my legacy was already being seen as theft from people who'd counted on inheriting money they'd never actually been promised. I found myself wishing I could explain my reasoning more clearly, could help them understand that my love for them had influenced every decision in that will. But the living can't hear the dead. And my family was already beginning to construct narratives that painted me as selfish, manipulated, or mentally unstable. The afternoon that was supposed to provide closure and clarity had instead opened wounds that I hadn't even known existed. My death had revealed the true extent of my family's financial problems, but my will had apparently created problems that might be even worse. As evening settled over Denver and my family members returned to their homes to begin the long process of adjusting their expectations and plans, I realized that my real education in human nature was just beginning. The people I'd thought I knew best were about to show me sides of themselves that I'd never imagined existed. The will reading was over, but the real story was just starting. 3 days after the will reading, I watched Uncle Bob pace around his kitchen while Aunt Patty sat at their granite breakfast bar with legal documents spread across the surface like battle plans. They'd been making phone calls all morning, reaching out to estate attorneys and researching precedents for will contests. The disappointment from David Morrison's office had crystallized into something much more dangerous. Determination. Bob stopped pacing and turned to face his wife with the kind of intensity I'd only seen from him during business negotiations. He told Patty that he'd been thinking about this all wrong, that they'd been approaching Jessica's will as grieving family members instead of thinking like the business people they were. The estate was worth over $4 million, and even if they could only recover a portion of it through legal action, the financial gain would justify the costs and effort involved. Patty nodded enthusiastically, her real estate training evident in how she'd organized the papers in front of her. She'd printed out comparable sales data for my downtown loft and mountain cabin, calculated potential commission earnings, and researched the market value of my art collection. According to her analysis, I'd given away assets worth at least $600,000 that could have been sold to benefit the family instead. Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell, and I followed Patty as she went to answer it. Mike stood on their front porch with a cardboard box in his hands and an expression that mixed determination with something that looked almost desperate. When Patty invited him in, he set the box on their coffee table and explained that he'd spent the past 2 days going through his financial records and gathering evidence. The box contained printouts of bank statements, copies of checks, and handwritten notes that Mike claimed proved I'd borrowed money from various family members. Over the years, he'd found records of small loans from Bob, contributions toward my business startup costs from Mom, and even a few $100s he'd lent me during college. None of these debts had been acknowledged in my will, Mike argued, which meant the estate owed the family significantly more money than David Morrison had distributed. I stared at the documents in horror, recognizing immediately what Mike had done. Every loan he'd referenced had been repaid in full, usually with interest or generous gifts that more than covered the original amounts. The check from Mom for my business startup had been returned to her within 6 months, along with a matching contribution to her retirement account. The college loans from Mike had been repaid when I'd bought him a used car after his graduation. But Mike had carefully selected only the original loan documents, while ignoring any evidence of repayment. Bob examined Mike's evidence with the focused attention of someone who'd built a construction business by paying attention to financial details. He pointed out that even if the estate recognized these debts, the amounts were relatively small. Compared to the foundation bequest, what they needed was a more fundamental challenge to the will's validity. Something that questioned my mental capacity or suggested undue influence from outside parties. Patty suggested that they focus on my relationship with Rachel, my business partner who'd been named as the foundation's initial chair. She'd always seemed suspicious of how close Rachel and I had become, and she wondered aloud whether our partnership had been more than just professional. Perhaps Rachel had manipulated me into leaving my money to the foundation so she could control it, Patty speculated, rather than allowing my family to inherit what was rightfully theirs. Mike seized on this theory with obvious relief, as if having someone else to blame made the situation easier to process. He started recounting conversations where I'd mentioned Rachel, searching for evidence that our friendship had been inappropriate or manipulative. He reminded Bob and Patty about how often Rachel had attended family gatherings in recent years, how I'd sometimes chosen to spend holidays with her family instead of my own. The three of them spent the next hour constructing a narrative that painted Rachel as a master manipulator who'd gradually isolated me from my family while positioning herself to benefit from my death. According to their theory, the foundation was just an elaborate scheme to allow Rachel to control my money while maintaining a facade of charitable purpose. They convinced themselves that I'd been the victim of financial elder abuse, despite the fact that I'd been 34 years old and entirely capable of making my own decisions. I wanted to scream at them, to somehow make them understand how wrong they were about Rachel and how offensive their assumptions were about my judgment and independence. Rachel had been my closest friend precisely because she'd never wanted anything from me except friendship and professional partnership. She'd been successful in her own right, had her own money and career goals, and had actually tried to talk me out of some of my more generous charitable impulses. Their plotting was interrupted by another visitor, and this time it was Amy who appeared at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a manila folder clutched against her chest. She'd been crying again, but these weren't the grief tears I'd seen at my funeral. These were angry, frustrated tears that spoke of sleepless nights and arguments with Carlos about their financial future. Amy sat down heavily on Bob and Patty's couch and opened her folder to reveal medical bills and school enrollment, forms that painted a stark picture of her family's needs. Her oldest daughter, Emma, needed braces that would cost $8,000. Her middle child, Sophia, had been diagnosed with a learning disability that required expensive tutoring, and her youngest son, Diego, had asthma that meant constant medical expenses and prescription costs. She explained to the others that $30,000 sounded like a lot of money until you started dividing it among three children's urgent needs. The orthodontic work alone would consume more than a quarter of her inheritance. That was before considering Sophia's educational support or Diego's ongoing medical care. Carlos had been working overtime to try to cover their regular expenses, but the medical bills were piling up faster than they could pay them. Bob listened to Amy's financial breakdown with the calculating expression he wore when estimating construction costs. I could see him recognizing opportunity in her desperation. He told Amy that her children's needs were exactly the kind of evidence they needed to challenge my will, that no reasonable person would leave millions to strangers. While their own nieces and nephews struggled to afford basic medical care, Amy's eyes lit up with something between hope and determination. As Bob explained their theory about Rachel's manipulation and undue influence, she admitted that she'd always felt somewhat jealous of my relationship with Rachel, that it had sometimes seemed like Rachel understood me better than my own family did. Maybe that understanding had been deliberate, Amy suggested, part of a long-term plan to separate me from my family and gain control over my assets. Mike pulled out his phone and started making notes as the three of them brainstormed additional evidence for their contest case. Amy remembered conversations where I'd seemed tired or stressed about business decisions, which could be portrayed as evidence of diminished capacity. Bob recalled family gatherings where I'd seemed distracted or withdrawn, which might suggest that Rachel was already exerting inappropriate influence over my thinking. Patty contributed her own observations about my charitable giving during my lifetime, pointing out that I'd never shown particular interest in women's business issues until after I'd started working with Rachel. She suggested that the foundation idea had been Rachel's from the beginning, that I'd been gradually convinced to embrace causes that had never been important to me before. The more they talked, the more convinced they became that they weren't just fighting for money, but for justice. They were protecting my memory from someone who'd taken advantage of my generosity and good nature. They were ensuring that my real family received what I would have wanted them to have if I'd been thinking clearly. They were correcting a terrible mistake that had been made while I was under the influence of someone with ulterior motives. I watched this transformation with growing horror, seeing how quickly grief and disappointment had evolved into conspiracy theories and character assassination. These people who claimed to love me were preparing to destroy the reputation of my closest friend and business partner based on nothing more than their own financial disappointment and wounded expectations. Their planning session was interrupted by Tyler, who had apparently been listening from the basement and finally decided to join the conversation. He bounded up the stairs with the kind of energy that came from finally having a purpose after months of aimless unemployment. Tyler announced that he'd been doing internet research about will contests and had found several cases where families had successfully challenged charitable bequests by proving undue influence. Tyler had also been investigating Rachel's background, using social media and professional networking sites to build a profile of her life and relationships. He'd discovered that Rachel owned a house in Cherry Creek that was worth almost as much as my downtown loft, which he claimed proved that she didn't need my money and therefore must have had ulterior motives for encouraging the foundation bequest. The fact that Rachel's financial success actually undermined their theory of financial manipulation didn't seem to occur to any of them. Instead, they interpreted her wealth as evidence that she was sophisticated enough to execute a complex scheme to gain control over my assets. Tyler had even found photos of Rachel at charity events and business conferences, which he suggested proved that she was obsessed with philanthropy and had convinced me to share her interests against my family's needs. Bob was increasingly impressed with Tyler's research skills, suggested that his son should be the one to coordinate their legal challenge. Tyler had time available, familiarity with internet research, and enough distance from the emotional aspects of the situation to think strategically about their case. Plus, Bob added with obvious pride, Tyler had always been smart about technology and social media in ways that their generation couldn't match. Tyler accepted this responsibility with visible excitement, finally having a project that made him feel valuable and needed. He started making lists of additional research tasks, from investigating David Morrison's relationship with Rachel to tracking down other women who'd received grants from organizations similar to the planned foundation. He was convinced that they could build a pattern of evidence showing that the foundation was part of a larger scheme targeting wealthy businesswomen. Amy asked about the costs of hiring an attorney to contest the will, and Bob assured her that he'd already spoken with a lawyer who specialized in estate disputes. The attorney had explained that will contests typically worked on a contingency basis, meaning the legal fees would be paid from any successful recovery rather than requiring upfront costs. The lawyer had also mentioned that even unsuccessful contests often resulted in settlement negotiations that could increase family inheritances substantially. Mike wanted to know about the timeline for filing a challenge. Patty consulted the notes she'd taken during her own phone calls with attorneys. They had several months to file their contest, but the lawyer had recommended moving quickly to preserve evidence and demonstrate serious intent. The estate couldn't distribute the foundation funds until any challenges were resolved, which meant that delay tactics alone might pressure David Morrison to recommend settlement discussions. The group spent another hour discussing strategy and dividing responsibilities. Bob would handle the financial analysis and serve as the primary contact with their attorney. Patty would investigate the real estate transactions and property valuations. Mike would organize the family loan documentation and coordinate with Mom to gather additional evidence. Amy would focus on demonstrating family need and collecting medical bills or school records that showed how much the children needed additional financial support. Tyler would continue his internet research and social media investigation of Rachel and the foundation concept. By the time their meeting broke up, they'd transformed from disappointed family members into something that looked more like a legal conspiracy. Each person had specific tasks and deadlines. They'd scheduled weekly meetings to share progress and adjust their strategy. They'd even created a shared online folder where they could upload documents and research findings. I followed Mike as he drove home to his house in Aurora, listening to him practice explaining the plan to Jennifer. He'd convinced himself that the will contest was about protecting his children's future and honoring my true intentions, rather than simply grabbing money he'd never been promised. The narrative they'd constructed made him feel righteous rather than greedy, justified rather than opportunistic. Jennifer's reaction was more cautious than Mike had obviously expected. She pointed out that legal challenges were expensive and time-consuming, that they could damage family relationships permanently, and that there was no guarantee of success. She also reminded Mike that I'd specifically left them money for their children's education, suggested that I'd been thinking about their needs, even if I hadn't provided as much as they'd hoped. Mike dismissed Jennifer's concerns with increasing irritation, explaining that she didn't understand the full scope of Rachel's manipulation or the legal precedents for successful will contests. He accused Jennifer of being naive about business and legal matters, of not understanding how much money was at stake or how much their family needed additional financial support. His tone grew sharper as Jennifer continued to express doubts, until she finally stopped arguing and agreed to support whatever decision he made. I could see that Jennifer remained unconvinced, but she was tired of fighting about money and worried about the stress Mike was putting on their family. She agreed to help organize their financial records and document their children's educational needs. But she made it clear that she didn't want to be involved in any personal attacks against Rachel or any attempts to damage my reputation. Meanwhile, Amy was having a similar but more emotional conversation with Carlos at their townhouse in Westminster. She was crying again as she explained the will contest plan, alternating between anger at my apparent betrayal and excitement about the possibility of recovering more money for their children. Carlos listened quietly, his mechanic's practical nature making him skeptical of complicated legal schemes. Carlos pointed out that Amy had always spoken positively about Rachel before my death. She'd never expressed any concerns about inappropriate influence or manipulation. He wondered aloud whether the family was seeing conspiracies where none existed, whether their disappointment was clouding their judgment about my motivations and relationships. He also worried about the emotional toll that a prolonged legal battle might have on Amy and their children. Amy's response revealed how completely she'd embraced the narrative that Bob and Mike had constructed. She insisted that she'd always felt something was wrong about my relationship with Rachel, that she'd been too polite to express her concerns while I was alive. She claimed that the foundation bequest proved her instincts had been correct, that Rachel had indeed been manipulating me for years while pretending to be a loyal friend and business partner. Carlos eventually agreed to support Amy's decision, but his reluctance was obvious. He made her promise that they would consult with their own attorney before signing anything or committing to any specific legal strategy. He also insisted that they keep their children out of the dispute as much as possible, protecting them from the anger and resentment that was already consuming the adult family members. Back at Bob and Patty's house, Tyler was working late into the evening on his internet research project. He'd created detailed files on Rachel's professional history, her charitable activities, and her social media presence. He was looking for any evidence of financial problems, relationship issues, or business difficulties that might suggest ulterior motives for the foundation bequest. Tyler had also started researching me, which was disturbing in ways I hadn't anticipated. He was reviewing my social media posts from the past few years, looking for signs of depression, confusion, or uncharacteristic behavior that might support claims of diminished capacity. He was analyzing my business decisions and charitable giving for patterns that might suggest outside influence. He was essentially building a case that I'd been mentally incompetent or emotionally compromised during the period when I'd written my will. The most painful part of watching Tyler's research was seeing how selectively he interpreted evidence. Photos of Rachel and me at business events became proof of an inappropriate relationship. My donations to various charities became evidence that Rachel had convinced me to prioritize strangers over family. My decision to spend some holidays with Rachel's family instead of my own became proof that she'd successfully isolated me from my relatives. Tyler was creating a version of my life and personality that bore little resemblance to reality. But it was a version that supported the legal challenge they were planning. Every decision I'd made was being reframed as evidence of manipulation or mental incompetence. Every relationship I'd valued was being portrayed as potentially exploitative. Every charitable impulse I'd felt was being dismissed as the result of undue influence. As midnight approached and the various family members finally ended their planning and research sessions, I realized that my death had unleashed something destructive that went far beyond simple disappointment about money. My family was preparing to attack everything I'd cared about during my life, to destroy the reputation of my closest friend, and to portray me as either mentally incompetent or the victim of elaborate manipulation. The will that was supposed to reflect my values and priorities was being treated as evidence of my victimization. The foundation that was meant to help other women achieve business success was being portrayed as a scheme to steal money from my family. The friend who'd supported and encouraged me through years of building my company was being painted as a master manipulator who had taken advantage of my generosity. I found myself wishing that I could somehow warn Rachel about what was coming, could prepare her for the character assassination and legal challenges that my family was planning. But the living can't hear the dead, and Rachel would have to face this attack without any advance warning or opportunity to defend herself. As my family members went to sleep planning their legal strategy, I realized that my attempt to balance family support with broader, charitable goals had created a situation that was far worse than simple financial disappointment. I'd inadvertently set up a battle that would reveal the worst aspects of people I'd loved and trusted, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.